Welcome to Dead Quiet Mysteries, where every silence hides a secret waiting to be uncovered. New moon symbol. Before we dive in, tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from? Drop your city and country in the comments below. Globe showing Europe Africa detective ###. Chapter 1, A Visitor in Distress. It was on a damp and grey March morning that the peculiar business of the clockmaker first came to the attention of my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes. The streets of London outside our windows were slick with last night's rain, and the gaslight within our sitting room still fought to cast its pale glow against the stubborn gloom. I had settled myself in an armchair with a British medical journal, while Holmes, in his accustomed fashion, lounged on the sofa with the Times, the smoke from his pipe drifting lazily upwards like the ghosts of forgotten conversations. The tranquility of the morning was broken by the sharp clatter of boots upon the stairs, followed by a knock at our door, brisk, yet betraying an underlying hesitancy. Mrs. Hudson's voice announced the arrival of a Mr. Percival Trent, and before I could rise, the door opened to admit a gentleman whose bearing was at once precise and agitated. He was a man of middle years, spare of frame and with the fine, almost delicate hands of one accustomed to working with minute instruments. His coat was well cut but bore the faint sheen of wear, and his watch chain, of modest silver, quivered slightly as his fingers fidgeted at his waistcoat. The eyes behind his round spectacles darted from Holmes to myself and back again, as though uncertain of the propriety of disturbing us. "Pray be seated, Mr. Trent," said Holmes, his tone calm but inviting. "And relieve yourself of your hat. There is no crime in entering a room unarmed, though from your air I might deduce that you bring with you some misfortune, if not an outright peril." Trent sank into the chair opposite Holmes. "Mr. Holmes, I have been advised, by a colleague who swears to your extraordinary abilities, that you might offer assistance where the police have already chosen to do nothing. My workshop was broken into last night." Holmes steepled his long fingers and regarded the man with quiet interest. "Indeed? You speak as though nothing of value was taken, or else Scotland Yard would not be so dismissive." "That is precisely the difficulty," Trent replied. "As far as I can tell, none of my clocks, watches, or tools have been touched. No stock missing, no safe forced. Only," he faltered, producing from his pocket a small leather notebook. Opening it to a blank page, he drew in a deliberate hand a series of letters and numbers, A17, G4, K19, D2, L23, M8. Only a sheet of paper with this written upon it was stolen. I cannot fathom why. Watson though I am, and no stranger to the oddities of criminal enterprise, I confess the theft of such an apparently worthless scrap puzzled me. "Perhaps some apprentice's prank," I ventured. Trent shook his head. "I have but one apprentice, and he is away visiting family in Devon. Besides, the sheet was kept in my desk drawer, among personal papers. I discovered its loss this morning, the drawer having been tampered with." Holmes, who had not looked away from Trent's face during this account, now asked, "Tell me, sir, have you any rivals in your profession? Anyone who might bear you ill will?" Trent allowed himself a rueful smile. "The craft of horology, Mr. Holmes, is competitive only in so far as skill and reputation decide commissions. I am on good terms with my fellows, and cannot name a single enemy." Holmes reached for his magnifying glass from the mantel. "And yet," he said, "someone was willing to risk apprehension for the sake of that paper. Let us consider, Mr. Trent, that nothing in this world is stolen without purpose. Even the most trifling object may be the key to something greater." I observed that Holmes's attention was momentarily drawn to Trent's sleeve cuff, which bore a faint reddish smudge, and to the soles of his boots, damp but with a narrow stripe of pale grit along the edge. "You came directly from your workshop?" Holmes inquired. "Yes, straight from Clerkenwell." "Ah," Holmes murmured, as though this explained something, though he offered no enlightenment to me. Trent's agitation had not subsided. The yard inspector, he barely glanced at the matter. He advised me to be thankful nothing valuable was taken, and said that it was likely some vagrant sheltering from the rain who had rifled through my drawers. Holmes's lips curved in the faintest of smiles. Vagrants do not, as a rule, pick the locks of craftsmen's desks for the pleasure of abstracting meaningless codes. And they certainly do not leave without pawning whatever they might carry off. No, Mr. Trent, there is design here. The question is, whose? Trent shifted in his seat. Will you take my case, Mr. Holmes? Holmes regarded him in silence for a few moments, the distant rumble of carriage wheels from the street filling the pause. At last, he said, I will examine your workshop this afternoon. Until then, you must act as though nothing is amiss, speak of the matter to no one but Dr. Watson and myself. I would advise keeping your routine unchanged. Trent looked relieved. Then I am in your hands. When our visitor had departed, Holmes rose and paced before the fireplace. Watson, what do you make of it? That a man's workshop was entered, and only a scrap of paper taken. I see no clear significance. Precisely! Holmes exclaimed. It is what we do not see that interests me. A break-in without loss is as telling as a theft of great value. Both are acts of intent. The difference lies in what we are meant to think. He paused to refill his pipe, his eyes distant yet keen. Come, Watson. Let us see what this workshop holds. I suspect our Mr. Trent has told us all he believes to be relevant, but not all there is to know. And with that, Holmes swept his coat from its peg, and we stepped out into the wet streets, the morning's quiet quite forgotten in the first stirrings of a mystery. Chapter 2, The Scene of the Intrusion. Clerkenwell was alive with the clatter of carts and the cries of costermongers when Holmes and I arrived that afternoon at Mr. Percival Trent's workshop. The rain had ceased, but the street still shone with dampness, and the air bore the mingled scent of horses, coal smoke, and the faint tang of metal from the many tradesmen in the district. Trent's premises stood in a narrow lane, wedged between a printmaker's shop and a purveyor of brass fittings. The modest facade bore a signboard in neat gilt lettering, Percival Trent, Horologist. The front window displayed an arrangement of clocks, some chiming softly in a delicate chorus, their ticking a more constant and subdued music beneath. Inside, the air was warmer and faintly perfumed with the clean, almost medicinal smell of oiled brass and polished wood. The workshop proper lay behind the display room, a long, well-lit space with benches set against the walls, each meticulously arranged with tools, fine screwdrivers, tweezers, small files, and magnifying lenses. In one corner stood a cabinet of neatly labelled drawers, and in another, a tall iron safe. Holmes's entrance was brisk yet unhurried, his eyes already darting to the corners and shadows. He paused in the doorway, surveying the room as a general might a battlefield, noting its every contour before taking a single step forward. Where was the drawer in which you kept the stolen paper? He asked. Trent led us to the cabinet beside the rear bench. The second drawer down bore a small brass lock, which on closer inspection showed faint marks, tiny, shallow scratches about the keyhole. Holmes bent low, examining them with his lens. A deft hand, he murmured. No brute force. Whoever opened this has a craftsman's familiarity with fine mechanisms. It was no common burglar with a crowbar. He opened the drawer, revealing only some envelopes, a pair of spectacles, and a few folded bills of purchase. You have not altered anything since the discovery. Nothing at all, Trent replied. Holmes replaced the drawer and turned his attention to the floor beneath. He knelt, running a long forefinger along the join of two boards, then glanced towards the far end of the room. Watson, he said, note the dust here. Undisturbed in most places, but faintly displaced along this narrow track, see how it runs from the drawer to the window. I bent down to look. Indeed, there was the merest hint of disturbance, a subtle shift in the pattern of the fine sawdust that seemed to settle naturally over the boards. We followed the invisible trail to the window at the back. It was fastened, but Holmes worked the latch and swung it open. The sill outside bore a smear of reddish dust. Brick, Holmes said. Weathered, not fresh. The mortar is crumbling. We shall see presently where it came from. He leaned out slightly, studying the wall and the yard beyond. A nimble fellow could have scaled that fence without difficulty. And you are certain you left this window secured last night? Always, Trent assured him. I have a habit of checking it before I leave. Holmes nodded, closing the window again and dusting his hands. He turned slowly in the center of the room, letting his gaze rest on each workbench in turn. Then, quite suddenly, he walked to a shelf near the safe and lifted a small brass cogwheel. This is not from one of your own works, he said. Trent came forward. Indeed, no, it's part of a German clock I repaired some years ago. I keep it as a reference piece. Holmes replaced it gently. Curious. It has been recently handled, see the faint smear of oil here, fresher than the rest of your fittings. He moved to the safe and examined it carefully. It was untouched, the lock intact, its paint unmarked. Our visitor either knew exactly what he wanted, or had no interest in your more obvious treasures. As Holmes straightened, a faint scent caught his attention. He stepped towards the corner nearest the door, sniffed lightly, and smiled. Tobacco. Not your brand, I think. Trent shook his head. I do not smoke. Nor do your customers indulge while in here, I imagine. Never. Holmes glanced at me, as if to say that this alone was a piece of significance. Finally, as he was about to leave, Holmes stopped at a small iron stand by the workbench. On it sat an ornate clock case awaiting its mechanism. He studied it briefly, then asked, You keep no pet birds? Trent looked startled. Birds? Certainly not. Holmes said with a thin smile. Then the small imprint here, he indicated a faint, three-pronged indentation in the soft dust, is not made by a claw, but by something else entirely. We shall consider what. Without another word, he swept his gaze once more around the workshop, as though committing every detail to memory. Then he replaced his hat and gloves. As we stepped out into the lane, Holmes glanced back at the signboard above the shop. A craftsman's domain, he said softly, invaded not by a brute, but by another craftsman. One who leaves as little trace as possible, yet cannot help but betray his trade by the very precision of his intrusion. I was about to ask what he meant by the remark when he hailed a cab and instructed the driver to take us towards Farringdon Road. We have another stop to make, Watson, he said, and perhaps we shall learn where that red dust truly belongs. And with that, we rattled away from the lane, leaving behind the neat order of Mr. Trent's workshop and stepping further into a puzzle that, even then, Holmes seemed certain was far from trivial. Chapter 3, An Unsettling Coincidence. The following morning broke clearer than the day before, the weak spring sunshine pooling like pale gold across the table at which Holmes sat, leafing through a bundle of telegrams. I had just returned from my customary early round at the surgery when I found him thus engaged, his expression betraying a quiet satisfaction that invariably heralded a development in a case. You will recall, Watson, he began without looking up, that last evening I remarked upon the nature of our clockmaker's intruder, a fellow of skill, not brute force. This morning's correspondence supports that conclusion and widens the field of interest. He pushed one of the telegrams across the table. It bore the heading of the Charing Cross Telegraph Office and read, Professor Emery Blaine reports burglary. Stop only item missing. Private notebook containing numerical data. Stop all else undisturbed. Stop police investigating but no suspect. Stop. Professor Blaine. I repeated. I know the name, an authority in certain branches of applied mathematics, is he not? The same, said Holmes. And more to the point, an acquaintance of Mr. Percival Trent. They served together on the board of the Horological Society 2 years ago. I took the telegram again, puzzling over its significance. And his burglar also took nothing of obvious value. Holmes's eyes brightened. Exactly, Watson. 2 burglaries, 2 men of technical distinction, two seemingly worthless items stolen, a coded paper from Trent, a number-filled notebook from Blaine. And both incidents within the space of 24 hours. He rose, slipping the telegram into his pocket. I have already sent word to Professor Blaine requesting an interview. We shall call upon him this afternoon. Professor Blaine's residence was a tall, narrow house in Bloomsbury, its windows crowded with books that looked as if they might spill into the street given the smallest encouragement. The professor himself was a short, wiry man, his white hair standing in agitated wisps and his eyes full of restless energy. Holmes lost no time in bringing him to the point. Your notebook, Professor, describe it to me. Blaine adjusted his spectacles. An ordinary ledger, leather-bound, but of my own ruling. The contents, however, were rather specialized, a personal set of tables I have been compiling. Mathematical correlations relating to pendulum motion, though the figures would be incomprehensible to any without my notes. And were these tables complete? Nearly so, another month's work would have finished them. I cannot imagine their usefulness to anyone else. Holmes moved about the professor's study, scanning the haphazard piles of volumes and papers. The burglary, was the method of entry similar to that at Mr. Trent's premises? No sign of force, no disturbance to the rest of the room. Blaine nodded. Precisely. When I returned from my lecture last night, I found the window latch unfastened. Nothing missing but the notebook. I observed Holmes glance toward the window in question, a sash on the first floor overlooking a narrow service alley. He stepped to it, ran a finger along the sill, and then examined his fingertip. Even from where I stood, I could see a faint trace of reddish dust. Holmes's face betrayed no surprise. The same, he murmured. Blaine, for his part, seemed more irritated than alarmed. The constable assigned to the case suggested it might have been a student prank, though why any of my students should wish to rifle my home is beyond me. Pranks rarely involve such precision, Holmes said evenly. And your students, however mischievous, would hardly possess the skill to open a latch without a sound. Blaine regarded him curiously. Do you mean to suggest that this is part of some pattern? Holmes allowed himself a slight smile. Let us say that it bears the hallmarks of an operation conducted with deliberate intent. You and Mr. Trent may yet learn you are bound by more than professional acquaintance. When we had taken our leave, Holmes proposed a walk rather than returning directly to Baker Street. As we made our way through Russell Square, I ventured, you see a definite link between the two cases. A most definite one, he replied. But it is not merely the victims that interest me, Watson, it is the objects stolen. The sheet of symbols from Trent, the tables from Blaine, together, they suggest a composite of some sort. Separate, they may appear meaningless, combined, they may form a message. A cipher? I asked. Holmes inclined his head slightly but offered no elaboration. We had gone no more than a few streets when he paused abruptly at the entrance to a narrow court. There, leaning against a wall, stood a lank, red-haired youth in a patched coat, whistling a tune as he examined the contents of a small parcel. Holmes's gaze sharpened. The young man glanced up, caught sight of us, and with a quick motion wrapped the parcel and slipped it into his satchel. Without a word, he moved off at a pace just shy of a run. Curious, Holmes said softly, watching him vanish into the bustle. There is more of our story in that parcel than he would wish us to know. He made no move to pursue, which puzzled me. Why let him go? Because, Holmes replied, we are not yet ready for him to know we are aware of his part. Back at Baker Street, Holmes returned to his armchair and lit a fresh pipe. 2 burglaries, Watson, both surgical in execution, both leaving behind valuables untouched. The connection between Trent and Blaine may not end with the society's boardroom. And the red-haired youth. A messenger, I should think. One who has not the look of a tradesman's boy but the furtive caution of a man playing a small but critical role in a larger scheme. He leaned back, sending a stream of smoke to the ceiling. This business grows more intricate. We must be prepared for a third incident, and soon. I could not help but feel a prickling at the nape of my neck, for when Holmes made such predictions, they were seldom wrong. Chapter 4: The Red-Haired Messenger. It was 2 days after our visit to Professor Blaine that the next development occurred, delivered, quite literally, to our door. I had been sent by Holmes on some errand to purchase a particular chemical from a supplier in the Strand, a journey which took me the better part of an hour. Upon my return to Baker Street, I found our hallway door ajar and a draught stirring the thin carpet runner on the stairs. Mrs. Hudson was in conversation with a lank, red-haired youth whose sharp, fox-like features I recognized at once as belonging to the very fellow we had seen in Russell Square. He clutched a brown paper parcel to his chest, bound in twine and labelled in a cramped hand. "This is for Mr. Trent," he told Mrs. Hudson in a tone that implied urgency, though it was more a forced briskness than genuine haste. Before I could announce myself, the youth caught sight of me. His pale eyes flicked over my face and then away again, with the guarded wariness of a man who weighs the risk of flight in an instant. Instead, he thrust the parcel towards Mrs. Hudson. "You'll see it delivered, won't you?" "No delay." Without awaiting her reply, he stepped lightly down the stairs and out into the street. By the time I reached the doorway, he had vanished into the ebb and flow of traffic along Baker Street. Holmes emerged from the sitting room at the sound of my voice. "Ah, Watson, you've met our elusive young acquaintance again. I trust you did not frighten him away." "He brought this," I said, holding out the parcel. "Said it was for Mr. Trent." Holmes accepted it without comment and carried it to the table. With a flick of his penknife, he cut the twine and peeled back the paper to reveal a small, leather-covered case. Inside lay a pocket watch of exquisite workmanship, yet curiously unsettling to the eye. Its dial bore no numerals, but rather 12 distinct symbols picked out in deep blue enamel, arranged in the usual positions for the hours. The watch hands, gold, slender, and unmoving, were fixed at 13 minutes past 7. Holmes placed the case on the table and leaned over it, his eyes narrowing. "Unusual, is it not? A fine movement, I'll wager, but rendered useless as a timekeeper." I examined the symbols more closely. Some resembled abstract shapes, others were more reminiscent of old navigational marks, or perhaps shorthand characters from some forgotten script. "Do you recognize them?" I asked. "In part," Holmes said. "The 4th and the 9th are certainly derivatives of semaphore. The rest are less familiar, though the arrangement suggests more than mere ornamentation. One does not send such an object by messenger unless its meaning is both specific and concealed." He rose and fetched a sheet of paper, making a careful sketch of the watch face. "Observe, Watson, the hands fixed at this precise angle, 13 minutes past 7. That is not a random choice. It may be a coordinate, a key, or a signal to interpret the symbols beginning from a certain point." I recalled the stolen paper from Trent's workshop, with its odd sequence of letters and numbers. Could the two be connected? Holmes gave a faint smile. "I have entertained that possibility since the moment I saw this watch. The question is not whether they are connected, but how. Each item, the code, the numerical tables from Blaine, and now this symbolic dial, is like a gear in a larger mechanism. Only when all the pieces are in place will the device function." That afternoon, Holmes insisted we visit the archives of the British Museum's clockmaking collection. We travelled by cab through the pale sunlight, the wind still sharp with winter's aftertaste. In the museum's reading room, Holmes immersed himself in volumes on continental horology, making particular note of decorative dials from the early 19th century. I assisted where I could, though most of the texts were in French or German. At one point, he paused over an illustration of a ceremonial watch made for the Bavarian court. Its face bore symbols representing a cipher, used in conjunction with a separate ledger to convey private messages between monarch and minister. "You see, Watson," he murmured, "our watch is in good company. The device has precedent. But where is its companion key?" We left the museum with no immediate answer, but Holmes seemed quietly pleased. As we emerged into Great Russell Street, he said, "The watch is no more meant to tell the time than a sealed envelope is meant to be admired for its paper. Its value lies in what is locked within." The following morning brought a terse note from Mr. Trent. He had received the parcel by post, though how it had found its way to Baker Street in the hands of the red-haired youth was a mystery, and was mystified by its contents. He swore he had never seen the watch before and had no idea who might have sent it. Holmes read the note twice before laying it aside. "Our messenger did not deliver the parcel to Trent, Watson. He brought it to us. Whether by instruction or design, we have been invited to participate." I was about to ask who might extend such an invitation when Holmes's gaze became distant. "There is a pattern here that is almost complete. What we require now is the final intrusion, and I dare say it will come soon. When it does, we must be ready to see not only what is taken, but why." As he spoke, I could not shake the feeling that the pieces were moving into alignment, though whether towards discovery or danger, I could not yet guess. Chapter 5: The Distraction. For days passed without fresh incident, and the stillness sat uneasily upon me. Holmes, for his part, seemed in no hurry to pursue matters. He spent long hours stretched upon the sofa, eyes closed, hands folded across his breast, as though in a state of repose. I knew better. This was his peculiar form of concentration, outward idleness concealing a mind working with fierce precision. On the fifth morning, our quiet was interrupted by a sharp knock, followed by the appearance of Inspector Lestrade, his face carrying that peculiar satisfaction which police officers display when convinced they have struck upon the solution to a troublesome case. "Good day to you, Mr. Holmes. Doctor," he began briskly. "I thought you'd like to hear some news. We've taken a fellow into custody, caught him trying to fence a gold watch at a pawnbroker's in Holborn. Matches the description of your man." Holmes's eyes opened, but he did not rise. "Our man, Inspector? I do not recall giving you a description." "Red hair, slight build, fox-like face," Lestrade recited. "Same as the messenger you told the Yard about last year in that forgery affair." "That was a different messenger," Holmes replied evenly. "And you have arrested him because—" Lestrade held up a small notebook. "Because he had this in his pocket." He flipped it open to reveal a set of numbers written in a precise hand. "Looks a deal like the sort of code your Clockmaker chap had stolen." "Numbers alone do not make a code," Holmes murmured. "Did you find anything else?" "Symbols, perhaps?" "A certain pocket watch." "No watch, but the pawnbroker swears the one he tried to sell was unusual, odd face, not proper numerals. The buyer got suspicious, called for a constable. We brought him in. And under questioning." Lestrade gave a little shrug. "He claims he found the watch lying in the gutter. We're holding him for receiving stolen property." Holmes sat up, swinging his legs over the side of the sofa. "You will of course investigate the watch's provenance. But I tell you now, Lestrade, this arrest will lead you no closer to the true instigator of these burglaries." The inspector bristled. "You don't think he's involved?" "Oh, he is involved," Holmes said. "But as a pawn is involved in a chess match, moved by another's hand, and ultimately expendable." Lestrade frowned but made no argument. He left with a curt promise to keep us informed. When the door closed, I turned to Holmes. "Surely if the man had the watch, or one like it, that proves he is connected." "Connected, yes," Holmes agreed, "but not central. The hand that directs this business would never risk being caught at the periphery. This arrest is precisely what our antagonist would wish, the police congratulating themselves on a swift resolution, and the real work continuing unimpeded. He reached for his pipe and began filling it with measured strokes. Lestrade's man will either be released for lack of evidence or quietly vanish into a prison cell, leaving the matter to fade from official attention. And you are content to let that happen? I am content to allow our opponent to think his plan has succeeded. The longer he believes himself unobserved, the more boldly he will act. When the final piece is in play, Watson, we shall have him. Holmes's prediction of boldness proved true sooner than I expected. That afternoon, he received a note, delivered by hand but unsigned. It contained only a single line, neatly written. The third will follow before the week's end. No address, no date, no clue to the writer's identity. Holmes read it once, folded it, and placed it in the inside pocket of his coat. You recognize the hand? I asked. It is a style I have seen, deliberately even, as though drawn rather than written. Meant to disguise the natural character. Yet the spacing between the words betrays a familiarity with drafting instruments, one accustomed to mechanical precision. Like a clockmaker? Or an engineer? Or a mathematician? Or someone else entirely? We must not leap too quickly. That evening, Holmes proposed a walk through Clerkenwell, ostensibly to take the air. We passed Trent's workshop, where the lamp still glowed within, the man himself bent over a bench. Holmes lingered just long enough to observe the rhythm of passers-by in the narrow lane. Notice, Watson, he said quietly, how the same boy has passed this shop 3 times in 20 minutes. He feigns delivering circulars, but his eyes are always on the door. I looked again. The boy, dark-haired, in this case, was indeed loitering with a bundle of papers under his arm. He disappeared around the corner without delivering a single one. You think he is watching Trent? I asked. I think, Holmes replied, that someone is taking the temperature of our scene before making his move. We returned to Baker Street in silence, each with our own thoughts. For my part, the picture remained maddeningly incomplete. 2 burglaries, a mysterious watch, a red-haired messenger under arrest, and now a cryptic warning of a third theft to come. Holmes, however, seemed almost serene, as though the pattern before him was at last resolving into something he could read. Before retiring, he stood at the window, looking out at the lamp-lit street. The game is not to prevent the next act, Watson, he said softly. It is to let it play out exactly as our adversary intends, and to be waiting, unseen, when the curtain falls. Chapter 6, The Third Incident. It was late on a Thursday evening when Holmes's long-anticipated final piece arrived, though not in the orderly fashion he might have preferred. The fire had burned low in the grate, casting our sitting room into a shifting half-light. Holmes was at his desk, making careful notations in his index of criminal monographs, when a sudden rap came at the door. Mrs. Hudson ushered in a constable in a dripping greatcoat, who announced himself as Police Constable Harrington from the Marylebone Division. There's been another burglary, sir, he said, removing his helmet. Inspector Lestrade thought you'd want word straight away. Holmes rose without haste but with unmistakable interest. The victim? Mrs. Eleanor Rathberry, retired telegraph operator. Lives alone on Welby Street. She says she woke to hear someone downstairs, but by the time she lit her lamp, they'd gone. Anything missing? Holmes asked. Just a small wooden box from her parlor cabinet. No sign of damage to the door or windows. Inspectors still on the scene. Holmes's eyes met mine, and I saw the spark there. Watson, your hat and coat. The third act begins. Welby Street lay in a quiet quarter, the kind of row where the uniformity of brick fronts is broken only by the occasional painted door. Mrs. Rathbury's house was narrow and neat, the door already guarded by a constable with his collar turned up against the damp. Rosewood, about a foot long, brass lock, though I rarely bother locking it, and a small engraving plate on the lid with my initials. Holmes began a slow circuit of the parlour. He examined the cabinet where the box had stood, the mantelpiece, the rug beneath. At the window, he paused, running a fingertip along the sill. He held it up to the light. There it was again, that faint trace of reddish dust. "You keep this window latched at night?" he asked. "Always." "And it was latched when I came down this morning," Mrs. Rathbury replied. Holmes crouched to inspect the catch, then took from his pocket a thin strip of metal, which he worked into the gap between sash and frame. With a deft twist, the latch sprang open. "A fine hand indeed," he murmured. No splintering, no telltale scratches, just enough pressure to trip the mechanism. Lestrade, still writing, muttered, "You're going to tell me this dust is the same as at the other two scenes?" "I am," said Holmes simply. Holmes next examined the hearth. "You had a fire last night?" Mrs. Rathbury nodded. "I keep a small one against the damp." The ash in the grate was undisturbed, but on the fender lay a single brass tack, flattened on one side. Holmes pocketed it without comment. From the parlour, he moved to the narrow hall. There, on the mat just inside the front door, lay a minute fragment of blue enamel. Holmes bent to pick it up, holding it to the lamplight. "Curious," he said, "how these shades of blue seldom occur naturally, save in lapis or cobalt glass." I thought at once of the enamelled symbols on the strange pocket watch. Lestrade was questioning the neighbours when we stepped outside. The street was still, save for the glisten of rain on cobbles. Holmes, hands clasped behind his back, walked the length of the front garden's low wall, then stopped at the side gate. He opened it and peered down the narrow strip of yard to the back. A length of wire, no longer than a man's hand, lay in the wet earth near the rear steps. Holmes picked it up, straightened it, and passed it to me. "Note the kink at the end, ideal for slipping a small latch." "You think the intruder came this way?" I asked. "I think," he said, "that he left by this way. Entry was likely by the window, departure by the yard, to avoid being seen from the street." He stepped out into the alley beyond the yard. The row of houses backed onto a low brick wall, beyond which stood a disused warehouse, its walls the colour of rust, its mortar weathered to powder. Holmes pressed his fingers lightly to the bricks, and when he drew them back, they bore the same reddish dust. "The source, Watson," he said with satisfaction. "And not merely a backdrop, this warehouse is part of our adversary's theatre." On the cab ride back to Baker Street, Holmes was uncharacteristically silent, his gaze fixed on the sketch he had made of the blue enamel fragment. I knew better than to interrupt, but at last he said, "3 burglaries, 3 objects stolen, each meaningless alone, each lifted with surgical precision. The dust, the wire, the enamel, all threads from the same loom. And Lestrade's prisoner. A decoy, as I told you. The true hand moves unseen, but we are close enough now that the shape of the tapestry begins to show." Once at Baker Street, Holmes laid the brass tack, the enamel fragment, and the length of wire on the table beside the drawing of the watch face and the reproduction of Trent's stolen code. He stood over them like a conductor before an unfinished score. "Tomorrow," he said at last, "we invite our 3 victims here, Trent, Blaine, and Mrs. Rathbury. They will hear only part of the truth, but enough to draw the spider from his web." His voice was calm, but I saw the flicker of anticipation in his eyes. The game, which had begun with a missing scrap of paper in a clockmaker's drawer, was entering its final movement. And though I could not yet read the full arrangement of clues, I sensed that Holmes already had the melody in hand. Chapter 7: Gathering of the Puzzled. Thursday noon saw our sitting room at Baker Street in a state of careful preparation. Holmes had cleared the table of his chemical apparatus and covered it with a clean cloth. Upon it he arranged 3 items: a reproduction of the coded sheet stolen from Trent's workshop, a neatly copied page of Blaine's numerical tables, and a full-size drawing of the pocket watch dial, complete with its strange blue symbols. Beside these lay a small envelope containing the brass tack, the wire, and the fragment of enamel recovered from Mrs. Rathbury's house. "You've set them out as though for a museum display," I remarked. "As bait, Watson," Holmes replied. "Our quarry will be here soon enough, though not yet visible." By 12:30, our guests arrived in quick succession. Mr. Percival Trent appeared first, removing his hat and gloves with the fastidious care of a man accustomed to precise movements. He seemed ill at ease, glancing often at the array on the table. Professor Emery Blaine followed, carrying under his arm a folio of papers and wearing an expression of mild curiosity, as though this gathering were a kind of academic symposium. Last came Mrs. Eleanor Rathbury, upright and brisk despite her years, her eyes darting over every object in the room. Holmes greeted them with a warmth that belied his usual reserve. "My friends," he began once all were seated, "you have each suffered an intrusion of a most particular nature. I have reason to believe these incidents are connected, and that the objects taken from you form parts of a single design." He gestured to the table. "Here is what I have been able to reconstruct: Mr. Trent's missing paper, Professor Blaine's stolen tables, and the face of a watch recently delivered under curious circumstances. Note that none of these has obvious market value. Their worth lies not in the materials, but in the meaning concealed within them." Trent leaned forward. "But why would anyone want these things from us?" "That," Holmes said, "is the question our unseen antagonist would prefer you not to ask. I will say only that the answer lies in a cipher, one that cannot be read without all 3 components. Your items, when combined, become the key to something of considerable value." Mrs. Rathbury gave a dry laugh. "Value to whom?" "My box held nothing more than medals and certificates." Holmes's gaze lingered on her for a moment. "Objects can be as deceptive as the men who take them, madam." For nearly an hour, Holmes directed a series of seemingly idle questions about Trent's commissions, Blaine's research, and Rathbury's work at the telegraph office. He moved with the light touch of a violinist tuning strings, coaxing from each the details he needed while revealing nothing of his own conclusions. At length, he rose. "I have asked you here not merely to compare notes, but to offer a word of caution. You are in possession, whether knowingly or not, of knowledge for which someone is willing to break into secure premises and risk discovery. Until this matter is concluded, I advise vigilance." Blaine looked doubtful. "Do you believe they will try again?" "I believe," Holmes said, "that our adversary has not yet secured what he needs. A man who has made 3 perfect entries will not balk at a 4th. Trent's face paled slightly. "Then what are we to do?" Holmes's answer was swift. "You will do nothing out of the ordinary. You will each return home as though our meeting had been of no consequence. You will lock your doors, yes, but not bar your windows. You will keep the same habits and see the same acquaintances. Above all, you will refrain from discussing this case with anyone outside this room." Mrs. Rathbury's eyes narrowed. "You mean to use us as bait?" Holmes inclined his head. "The safest place to catch a hand is when it reaches for the prize." When our guests had departed, Holmes closed the door and stood for a moment in thought. "They are uneasy, Watson, but they will do as I ask." "And if the culprit is among them?" I ventured. "Then, my dear fellow, the net will draw all the tighter." He turned to the window and scanned the street. "There is another matter. I expect our unseen listener has already heard enough to act. This gathering was not for our friends alone." "You mean someone was watching the house?" Holmes gave a faint smile. "More than watching. The glint from the roof opposite told me a small mirror was in use, flashes no doubt signaling to a companion farther down the street. We shall know in due course to whom. That evening, Holmes laid out his plan. We shall divide our watch between two locations, you at Trent's workshop, I at the warehouse behind Mrs. Rathbury's. If the intruder makes his move, one of us will see it. And if fortune favors us, we shall see the mind that directs him as well. I could not help but feel a twinge of anticipation as I readied my revolver. The sense that the long chase was nearing its end set my nerves on edge. Holmes, by contrast, was the picture of composure, methodically checking his watch, his own watch, not the enameled curiosity, before slipping it into his pocket. At times like this, Watson, he said, success is a matter of patience. We have set the stage, placed the props, and drawn the curtain halfway. Now we wait for our actor to make his entrance. The following night found us at our appointed posts. I sat in the dim back room of Trent's workshop, peering through a narrow gap in the curtain at the lamplit street. Hours passed, broken only by the faint ticking of a clock on the workbench. Somewhere across the city, Holmes was watching the shadowed yard of the warehouse, his mind, so I knew, working as tirelessly as the gears in one of Trent's finest timepieces. Near midnight, a movement caught my eye, a slim figure crossing the street with deliberate care, glancing once toward the workshop window before slipping into the shadows beside the building. I held my breath, my hand tightening on the revolver. The game was in motion. Chapter 8, The Cipher's Secret. It was shortly after midnight when the waiting ended. I had just glimpsed the shadowed figure at Trent's workshop when the quiet was broken by a sharp metallic sound, the whisper of a lock yielding under practiced hands. The intruder slipped inside with scarcely a rustle. Moonlight from the street lamp caught the edge of his profile, a lean man, not the red-haired messenger but another altogether, his hair dark and neatly brushed, his movements precise. He went straight to the cabinet where the coded sheet had once lain. I stepped forward, revolver raised. "That will do," I said. For a heartbeat he froze, then turned, the faintest smile on his lips. "Dr. Watson, I presume." Before I could reply, a whistle shrilled from somewhere beyond the lane. In an instant, the man bolted for the window. I lunged, catching his coat, but he tore free and dropped into the shadows outside. I gave chase, only to see him vanish down the narrow alley toward the warehouse. And there, as though materializing from the darkness itself, stood Holmes. In one swift motion he thrust his cane into the fugitive's path, sending him sprawling on the cobbles. Two plainclothes constables emerged from the gloom, pinning the man before he could regain his feet. Holmes knelt beside him. "Mr. Algernon Pike," he said quietly. "Former apprentice to Mr. Percival Trent. I rather thought we should meet before the night was out." The following afternoon, our sitting room at Baker Street was crowded, Trent, Blaine, Mrs. Rathbury, Lestrade, and myself. Pike sat between two constables, his expression alternately sullen and defiant. Holmes stood at the hearth, hands clasped behind his back. "The matter," he began, "is now at an end, though its design has been complex enough to merit explanation." He gestured toward the table, where the watch, the reproduced code, and Blaine's tables lay side by side. The first theft, Mr. Trent's sheet of letters and numbers, was the primary key. Each letter represented a column in Professor Blaine's notebook, and each number a row. When the two were combined, they produced a sequence of coordinates. Blaine frowned. "Coordinates to what?" Holmes smiled faintly. "To the symbols on the watch face." Mrs. Rathbury's box contained no treasure in the ordinary sense, but in a false bottom beneath her medals lay a small booklet, one she did not realize was there, holding the cipher's final translation key. The intruder who took the box discarded its visible contents, keeping only the booklet. I started. "But how could you know such a thing?" Holmes's eyes twinkled. From Mrs. Rathbury's own account. She kept her box in the same position for years, yet the dust mark it left on the cabinet shelf was a quarter-inch shorter than the box's height. That indicated a concealed compartment. A natural hiding place for the last part of the cipher. Trent's brow furrowed. And the cipher's purpose? It revealed the location of a cache hidden decades ago, wartime jewels smuggled into London to avoid enemy seizure. The reddish brick dust found at all three scenes came from the very wall in the disused warehouse backing onto Mrs. Rathbury's yard, where the cache was concealed. Pike, who once worked under you, Mr. Trent, recognized the markings on your stolen sheet for what they were, part of the old cipher used by certain watchmakers during the war to pass secret messages. He traced the other holders of its components, you and Blaine through your society connection, Mrs. Rathbury through her work at the telegraph office, where she had been entrusted with the final key. Holmes turned to Lestrade. The red-haired youth you arrested was merely Pike's courier. He delivered the watch to me, perhaps at Pike's instruction, perhaps in a moment of independent mischief, knowing I might take interest. Either way, Pike hoped to retrieve it before I could connect it to the other thefts. Our meeting here last week told him the game was up unless he acted quickly, hence his return to Trent's last night, intending to secure the sheet and complete his set before disappearing. Lestrade snorted. And now he'll disappear into a prison cell instead. Pike glared up at Holmes. You think you're clever? Those jewels would have done more for me than they ever did for their owners. Perhaps, Holmes said mildly, but the law takes a dim view of such redistribution. He signaled to the constables, who led Pike out. When the door closed, Trent let out a slow breath. I can't decide whether to feel relieved or insulted that my former apprentice thought to rob me. You may take comfort, Holmes replied, in knowing he failed. The cipher is incomplete without all its parts, and those parts are now safe. Blaine shook his head. And to think, I dismissed my notebook as nothing more than an academic curiosity. Mrs. Rathbury gave a brisk nod. And I will be checking my boxes for false bottoms from now on. When our visitors had gone, I turned to Holmes. You saw all this from the start, didn't you? Not all, he admitted, sinking into his chair, but enough. The precision of the entries told me we were dealing with a craftsman, the specific items taken told me they were pieces of a larger whole. The rest was a matter of tracing connections, professional, geographical, historical, until the shape of the design was clear. And the enamel fragment? I asked. A clue that the watch, or one like it, had been at Mrs. Rathbury's during the burglary. Blue enamel of that shade is rare and expensive. Its presence told me the watch was integral to the cipher, not an ornament introduced later. I could not help but smile. You do make it sound so simple. On the contrary, Watson, Holmes said, stretching his long legs toward the fire. It is seldom simple. But it is, as ever, a matter of observing what others overlook and refusing to be distracted by the convenient suspect. He closed his eyes, a faint trace of satisfaction on his features. Now, if you would be so good as to ring for tea, I think the Clockmaker's cipher has earned us both a quiet afternoon. And thus, with the rain beginning once more to patter against the panes, the matter was laid to rest, Holmes as calm in victory as he had been in pursuit, and I left, as always, marveling at the mind that could take a handful of scattered fragments and make from them a complete, unassailable whole.